Jeff, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you, Raj. It's great to be here.
Well, let's define this. What exactly is change fatigue?
So, change fatigue is just being exhausted from the amount of change that we're having to deal with that seems to be exponential, right? So, think about any personal changes you have yourself gone through in the last 1 to 3 years. And now add to that any changes in the geopolitical environment, add to that all the technological changes that you're dealing with, both around you, but also at work. And then specifically, we think about businesses. Businesses are going through an enormous amount of transformation, and employees are asked to keep up with that. So, as an example, this year, Gallup put out some research where they looked at, they interviewed over 18,000 employees and found that in 2016, that enterprise-wide changes, right? So big changes that were across organizations that these folks were employed at, there were two. And just a handful of years later, 2022, there were 10. And
It's a
why
big
that's it?
change. Yeah.
Yeah, why that's important is like in 2016, 74% of people felt engaged and kind of wanted to stay. That number dropped to 43%. And so the idea is that these folks are just exhausted from all the change.
Now, are you referring to change caused by COVID or something else?
Yes, yeah. So COVID was certainly a level setter for all of us, right? We were all going through it, no matter where you were, what organization you were in. Before then, there were a lot of changes that were happening. Then the pandemic really brought a lot of that to a head, and the changes only just continued. And I feel like now this is just my personal observation. I feel like people figured out during the height of the pandemic, okay, we can do this. And it's a little, in some ways, I feel like it's a little bit like going to war, like you're in it and you figure it out. But it's unsustainable for that to be like the status quo. And I feel like it's become the status quo that people are having to become more agile than ever before because change is just continuing at rapid pace.
It seems to me that it's gotten to the point where maybe you can't even recognize change because that's what we live in. It's just a day to day way of existing. So, how do you identify change fatigue, both in ourselves and perhaps in our audiences?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for ourselves, I can tell you for me that I feel like pre say go back 5 years ago, I work 8 o'clock at night, 9 o'clock at night, no big deal, like loving what I'm doing, and I'm still loving what I'm doing, and I'm still working hard, and I still get up early. But come 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, I want to watch a stupid TV show and eat dinner, and I don't want to go back to work.
Mm.
But in an organization, it's showing up in ways such as you find that employees are doing the minimum, they're resisting changes, right? So when a change comes down the pike, you hear a lot of naysayers like why this isn't going to work or complaining to other employees. You notice that the creativity or the kind of innovative mindset that's so critical in today's companies, you see that kind of waning. A lot of people, instead of doing what's best for the organization, they're trying to do what's best for them. A lot of CYA behavior. We've also seen an increase in like interpersonal conflict, right? A lot of infighting, decreased communication, decreased collaboration, poorer problem solving abilities, poorer decision making, right? And then finally, we're seeing a lot more increased HR complaints. And a lot of that seems to be connected to this idea that just people are exhausted from all the change.
I think a lot of organizations look for executives who can manage change. Change management, like that topic alone, is pretty popular, especially amongst companies who are wanting to or already going through some sort of transition. So, what are the biggest pitfalls in change communication?
Yeah, that's a great question. What are the pitfalls in change communication? First of all, as a coach, I often tell new clients that coaching is going to help you think different, be more purposeful and strategic with the way you think. the way that you act, the way that you feel, the way that you make decisions. And I feel like the change fatigue is impacting all that as well, right? Our thinking, our speaking, our behaving, our feeling, the way that we make decisions. And so as a result, people are bringing in experts in communicating change, right? Whether it's folks from HR, internal communication experts, or external communication experts to help them communicate the changes. And when you ask about pitfalls of change communication, I'm looking at this in kind of two buckets, right? There's the pitfalls about the messenger, right? And then there's the pitfalls about the message. When it comes to the messenger, I think about it in the same way, Raj, that I think about heart-centered leaders, right? The tenets of a heart-centered leader: purposeful, engaged, empathetic, understanding, and humble. And so some of the pitfalls around managing the communication of change around that include they're just not purposeful, right? They're talking about change that's happening, but they're not connecting it to the bigger picture. They're not connecting it to the why or to the mission, or they just generally lack engagement. Leaders in the organization aren't connected to the employees and the work. And so then when they talk about this change happening, they're speaking to an audience that has already tuned them out, or they're not showing empathy. They're failing to acknowledge and validate that change is difficult, that people are struggling, right? And so just meeting somebody where they're at from an emotional standpoint. And then there's a lack of understanding, right? They don't really show the appreciation of the real impact that change has. And then finally, they might show up with a lack of humility, right? They're just showing up as arrogant. As far as the message,
Mm.
I would say, Raj, that some of the pitfalls around that would be a lack of clarity and consistency. So the messages are vague, they're inconsistent, or they're complex, they're too hard to repeat, they're delayed. I had a client who found out that her team was going to be fired the next day. They found out through TV. That's not
Oh,
good.
it's terrible.
It's terrible.
Oh,
Exactly. And or you hear through the rumor mill, like, wait, what? They're getting rid of this department? That you think that should never happen. That happens, unfortunately, a lot. Or there's one-way communication. You and I have both experienced where people craft this great message and they just force it down, but they're not collecting feedback, they're not asking questions or giving people an opportunity to raise concerns. Or there's another study that was done last year of USC in Southern California. There's Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, where they showed that 50% of employees didn't trust their middle managers, right? And so you have these change messages happening at the top, and then they get to the middle managers, but there's a lack of trust. So it's really important to make sure that folks in the middle are equipped with carrying out the message. And then finally, the last thing I'll say about pitfalls is that sometimes there's a misalignment between the message and the behavior. Like, so for example, cutting positions and cutting other people's salaries while senior management are taking raises.
that's a tough one. That's a real tough one. That seems like a misalignment in values. And I think to your point on equipping the managers and supervisors from a communication point of view, it's important. How do you do it? What are the steps that you actually do? Do you get people in a room? Do you have a slide deck you share with them? What's the how-to on something like that?
Yeah, yes, and yes. So I think about two things. One is I think about there's the global message and then there's a local message. And then the second thing, which I'll come back to, but then the second thing I think about in terms of how do you actually manage the change is thinking about all the different channels of communication. So currently, there are already channels of communication. So people are using email, people might be using WhatsApp or some other text feature, people are picking up the phone, people are meeting in regular meetings, or they're meeting at the virtual water cooler. There might be folks meeting online versus meeting in person, right? So there's already all these formal and informal communication channels. And so when you think about having to manage the message that these companies are around change or other things that are happening, you want to think about these different channels and then making sure that you're reaching people in different ways, right? Because some people are better at reading emails than others. Some people, you need to really capture them, right? And so but going back to the global local thing, you might have this overarching message, but what the line manager needs to hear might be very different than what the senior manager needs to hear, right? And so I would say work with your communication expert, whether it's an internal person or an external person, and really help them first understand the culture of the environment and where there are differences in how people receive information and the kind of information that works for them, and then make sure that you're crafting the message according to that audience.
What is your advice for people who are in leadership roles to create this plan that actually manages expectations of all the communications they have to do? Because I think it's one thing to start talking to people about whatever's going on and how it may impact them. What are the ways to advise the leaders to set expectations? Because I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah. So, how do leaders set expectations around change? The word that comes to me is capacity, right? We as individuals and as organizations only have so much capacity for change. One of the things that the height of the pandemic did for everyone is it forced them to increase their capacity for change. And but what's happening is that people are having to continue to increase their capacity, and at some point it all implodes. And managing expectations for leaders, I would say, just remember that too much change too quickly equals resistance. So you can have even a good change. Earlier, I talked about a study where in 2022, the average company had 10 significant enterprise-wide changes happening. And some of those were good changes, but even good change is stressful. And so be aware that there's capacity issues. Prioritize your change. Like yeah, you want to change these 20 things and you think that you need to change 25 things, but what three things can you actually focus on right now before people start falling over the cliff? The other one is being purposeful versus reactive, right? So what strategy is the change connected to? And is it still being delivered in a way that's consistent with your values? Is it still aligned with the organization's mission and its purpose, right? And so making sure that rather than reacting to events, that we're responding to them, but we're also being very purposeful and looking not just at the present moment, but also the future, so that what you're doing now is sustainable over time and will make sense 5 years from now when you look back at the decisions that you made and the changes that you made. Is that Are you gonna feel good about that? And then finally, I would say make sure that you're being measured with the change and not just all over the place. We see a lot of kind of entrepreneurs and entrepreneur types that are just like bulls in a china shop, and they might be doing a lot of good things, just to really try to be measured and make sure that everyone's aligned around the change.
There's a lot to unpack there, and I want to touch on one thing that you alluded to, and that is the emotional toll that these changes take, because that's not managing the emotions, managing the energy. That's not something that is taught in business school. That is not taught anywhere I can recall in college or any kind of business training even. But it is in coaching. That's one of the things that a coach can help guide you through. Can you talk to me about how you get through that, what can be an exhausting process of just wading through all of that change, and how do you coach leaders to manage their direct reports on the emotional toll that change may be taking?
Yeah, so the emotional toll that change can be taking on the leaders and their directs is incredible, right? It can be insurmountable. And as leaders, first of all, we need to manage our own emotions, right? I'll say to start with, just start with good health habits, right? Unfortunately, when we're stressed, our exercise, our sleep, our nutrition, eating habits, drinking habits are the first to go, but actually they're the things that you need to really ramp up on. But I can give you some do's and don'ts of managing others' emotions. And then I'll give you kind of 6 steps when someone's emotionally stuck. So, some do's of helping others get unstuck. So, imagine that you're in the moment and they're having this sort of a emotional struggle, right? So, the first is be quiet until they're finished speaking. Second, help the person identify resources and build their confidence. Help the person discover meaning from their own experience. Remove your personal emotional response to what the other person is saying. Attempt to understand how the other person feels and what they're trying to say, even if they're not saying it. Remain calm and objective and use humor when appropriate. The flip of that, or the don't interrupt, don't try and fix the problem or the person. Don't talk about your own experience as a misguided attempt to show empathy. Don't take what the other person is saying personally. Don't defend or argue. Don't allow your emotions to get the best of you. And don't lose sight of the bigger picture. I'll end with these 6 steps. So when you think about being in this conversation where the other person is stuck, think of the letters LAVAAF, LAVAAF. So L, listen, right? Seek to understand rather than respond. An example of that would be hear what they're saying, hear what they're trying to say, hear what they're not saying. Second thing, the A is acknowledge, convey that you understand how they feel. For example, you're worried and not sure what the future holds. And then validate their feelings, normalize their experience. Yeah, these are scary times and we're all a little unsure. And then assure them, not assure them in areas are that you can't follow through on, but engender confidence that they will get through this. For example, I know you can handle this. We will get through this together. And then ask, find out what they need. What do you need right now? What can I do to help? And then finally, and this is one, Raj, that I see most often dropped, is follow up. Be proactive in reaching out and checking in. Hey, it's been a couple of days. How are you doing today?
Jeff, that's a wonderful playbook on how to get started and how to actually navigate your way through the entire process of communicating through a change management effort. Are there other things, maybe a set of ground rules that people should take into account for team communication? Some examples might be, do all cameras have to be on when they're doing virtual meetings? Flexible workplace policies to help mitigate that change fatigue. What are some ground rules that people should keep in mind?
Yeah, I love the question of what are some ground rules that people should keep in mind, because that suggests that there should be ground rules.
Yeah, implied by the question.
Yeah, love it. And because a lot of people think, should we really have ground rules? And my response to them is, if you ever played Monopoly, okay, or any other board game, think about the first time you played. And if you played where there was no instructions, right? And you don't know quite what to do, right? And so ground rules really help clarify how we're going to engage together. And it's a reference for when things go off the rails. And so what I would say in terms of coming up with ground rules, there's generally 3 ways to do it that it's talked about. One is you say, here they are, right? You come up with a set of ground rules that this is how we're going to agree to manage change and support each other, right? So, for example, one could be we ask for what we want, or we take accountability for our own stuff. We don't judge or blame others. It could be all kinds of things. Now, if you say, here's where they are, sometimes that's good, sometimes that's not good. If it's a very large organization, everyone's supposed to go with the same rules, then it makes sense. Another one is to get it from them. So ask, say, a team, ask the team to come up with a set of ground rules about how best to work together, how best to communicate, how best to collaborate, how best to make decisions together. And then finally is some combination thereof, right? So putting out kind of a draft set of ground rules and then asking for feedback and then coming up with rules. But in terms of the question around what about cameras? Should cameras be on, or should cameras not be on? And that's where I really feel like you need to have local versus global and flexible rules, right? So if you're, for example, let's say that you're on a team call and I'm going to make this up, but you meet twice a week for an hour and there's 100 people on the call, it's probably unrealistic to ask everybody on these calls where not everybody's going to be contributing to sit there in front of their cameras. But then at the same time, I would say, does everybody really need to be there? Versus if you're doing a training, and I know that when I'm doing virtual trainings, the expectation is that the cameras are on because you really want folks to be engaged. So, what I would say is that really work with the group, whether the group is, depending on the size, the whole organization, whether it's the department, whether it's even one other person that you work with, like a direct report or a manager, and figure out together what's going to work for you. And then revisit the ground rules over time. Like the needs will change. So make sure that you're being sensitive to that.
Very good. Jeff, there's a lot of information, a lot of ground that we covered today about how you manage that change fatigue, which is a real thing. It happens, and we see it in people that can take a big emotional toll. And you want to make sure that you're managing it so that you retain your best employees. And are there any other final notes that you want to share about this topic?
Yeah, I would say in terms of kind of a final note about this topic of managing change fatigue, remember that you don't need a magic bullet, right? You're here to support and lead others, not to fix them. I say like for when I talk to leaders, like a caring parent, it's your role to support your employee or child during different crises and different change events, regardless of how you yourself might feel. And I would say my going away message is that when all else fails, lead with your heart. When your heart leads, your mind will know what to do.
I love that as a closing comment, Jeff. Thank you very much for a thoughtful conversation. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, Raj. Great to be here.